You know the famous battles: D-Day, Gettysburg, Waterloo. But there's one day in medieval history that surpasses them all in sheer carnage. And somehow, it's been almost completely erased from memory. April 11, 1241, a spring morning in Hungary. By sunset, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people would be dead. The Sajo River would run red for 3 days. And Europe would come within months of total conquest by an empire most people today have never heard of. This is the story of the Battle of Mohi, the bloodiest single day in medieval warfare, and the moment when Western civilization nearly ended. By 1241, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Stretching from Korea to the borders of Poland, it encompassed more territory than Rome at its height. And it had been built in less than 40 years through military brilliance and calculated violence. The architect of this expansion was a man named Subutai. Almost unknown in the West today, Subutai was arguably the greatest military commander who ever lived. He commanded more soldiers, won more battles, and conquered more territory than Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon. 65 pitched battles, 32 nations conquered, campaigns on 3 continents. And he did it all while operating thousands of miles from his home base, consistently outnumbered by the civilizations he defeated. In 1241, at age 70, Subutai was planning what he intended to be his final campaign, the conquest of Europe. This wasn't a spontaneous raid. Mongol reconnaissance units had been gathering intelligence on European kingdoms for years, disguised as merchants and travelers. They knew the political divisions. They knew the military capabilities. They knew exactly where to strike. The invasion began in late 1240, with multiple armies moving simultaneously into Poland and Hungary. This was classic Mongol strategy. Divide your forces to confuse the enemy, force them to split their defenses, then concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point. King Bela IV of Hungary was one of the few European leaders who understood the threat. He'd received warnings from refugees fleeing the Mongol advance. He'd heard reports of entire cities annihilated in Russia and Ukraine. But he faced a critical problem. The Hungarian nobility didn't believe him. They thought the Mongols were just another steppe tribe, dangerous perhaps, but nothing European knights couldn't handle. This attitude was common across medieval Europe. Their military culture was built around the knight, heavily armored cavalry trained from childhood in mounted combat. Knights saw themselves as the ultimate warriors. The Mongols, by contrast, were mounted archers who wore lighter armor and avoided close combat when possible. To European eyes, they looked like cowards, barbarians too scared to fight properly. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove fatal, because Mongol military tactics were actually centuries ahead of European warfare. Where European armies relied on the charge of heavy cavalry to break enemy lines, the Mongols had developed a sophisticated combined arms doctrine, integrating light cavalry, heavy cavalry, infantry, and psychological warfare into a seamless system. They had standardized unit sizes, signal systems, and tactical formations that wouldn't appear in European armies for another 300 years. Bela managed to assemble an army anywhere around 15,000 Hungarian knights and soldiers, along with contingents from Croatia, Austria, and the Knights Templar. It was a substantial force by medieval standards, and it represented virtually everything Hungary had. If this army lost, there would be nothing between the Mongols and the rest of Europe. The Mongol force numbered between 20,000 and 30,000. Not an overwhelming numerical advantage, but enough. And crucially, these weren't recruits. They were professional soldiers who had been fighting together for years. Many had campaigned all the way from Mongolia to Hungary over 4,000 miles. They had conquered empires and destroyed armies 3 times their size. The two armies made contact in early April 1241 near the Sajo River. Bela chose what seemed like a defensible position. He placed his army on the west bank and established a fortified camp with wagons and earthworks. The Sajo wasn't huge, but it was a significant obstacle. Only one bridge crossed in the area, and Bela placed strong forces to guard it. His plan was sound by medieval standards. forced the Mongols to attack across the bridge, where their numerical advantage would be neutralized, and let the superior armor and weapons of Hungarian knights decide the battle. Sabbatai looked at this defensive position and saw exactly what he wanted, an enemy that had committed itself to a fixed location and was thinking defensively. For what he was planning, that was perfect. The night of April 10th was quiet, too quiet. Hungarian sentries watched Mongol campfires burning across the river. They could hear distant sounds in the darkness, but nothing immediately threatening. What they didn't know was that Mongol engineers were constructing multiple pontoon bridges downstream under cover of darkness, and a large Mongol force was moving into position to circle around the Hungarian camp entirely. Just before dawn on April 11th, the Mongols struck the bridge not with their main force, but with a probing attack designed to draw Hungarian attention. It worked. Hungarian knights rushed to defend the crossing, confident they could hold against any assault, and for several hours they did. Then, as the sun rose, the trap closed. Mongol heavy cavalry poured across the pontoon bridges downstream and slammed into the Hungarian camp from the east. Simultaneously, another Mongol force emerged from the northern forest. The Hungarians suddenly found themselves fighting on three sides, with a river at their backs. This was the tactic Europeans had never encountered, the feigned retreat and encirclement. The Mongols had used it to destroy the Khwarezmian Empire, to conquer China, to annihilate the Rus principalities. Now they were using it in Europe, and the Hungarian army had no idea how to respond. Mongol arrows came in clouds, thousands, fired in coordinated volleys, targeting the horses more than the riders. A knight in full armor could survive an arrow. His horse couldn't, and once dismounted, a heavily armored knight became a slow-moving target, essentially helpless against fast-moving mounted archers. The Hungarians fought back desperately. These were brave, well-trained warriors. But they were fighting a kind of warfare they didn't understand, against an enemy that refused to engage on their terms. Every time Hungarian knights charged, the Mongols simply rode away, circling around and pouring in more arrows. By midday, the Hungarian formation had completely collapsed. Soldiers fled in every direction, throwing away weapons and armor, desperate to escape. And this is where the real slaughter began. Sabbatai had deliberately left one apparent escape route open to the west. Terrified Hungarian soldiers saw it and ran, abandoning all formation in their panic to survive. Thousands streamed away from the battlefield. That's exactly what the Mongols wanted, because that escape route led directly into a killing ground they had prepared. For the next 30 kilometers, Mongol cavalry pursued the fleeing Hungarians in what military historians call pursuit to destruction. This wasn't battle anymore. It was systematic extermination. The Mongols had set up ambush positions along the route. They'd stationed fresh horses at intervals so their cavalry could maintain pursuit without tiring. They'd even placed blocking forces to catch anyone who made it far. The Hungarian soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, were hunted down methodically. The Mongols would ride alongside groups of fleeing men and shoot them with arrows, lance them, trample them. They took very few prisoners. The pursuit lasted all day and into the night. By the time it ended, the Hungarian army had been effectively destroyed. Out of 15,000 men, perhaps 3,000 survived. King Bela escaped only by abandoning his army and fleeing with bodyguards. But the Mongols weren't done. The battle was only phase 1. Phase 2 was making sure everyone in Europe understood what happened at Mohi and what it meant. The Mongol army moved through Hungary systematically. When cities surrendered immediately, the Mongols might spare most of the population. When they resisted, everyone died. Contemporary chronicles describe the devastation in apocalyptic terms. Bodies were so numerous in some areas that you could walk for miles stepping only on corpses. The city of Pest was burned to the ground, its population of over 30,000 massacred in a single day. Esztergom, Hungary's capital, was captured and destroyed so thoroughly it never fully recovered its former importance. This wasn't random destruction. It was calculated psychological warfare, sending a clear message: surrender immediately and you might survive. fight back and you'll be annihilated. And it was working. Panic spread across Europe. The Pope called for a crusade against the Mongols, but European kingdoms were too terrified to mount effective defense. Many nobles prepared to flee to England or Ireland, believing the continent was lost. Subutai was planning his next moves. He'd sent reconnaissance forces into Austria and Italy. His main army was positioned to strike Germany. Everything pointed to a full-scale conquest of Western Europe. Then something completely unexpected happened. On December 11th, 1241, 8 months after Mohi the Great Khan Gedai died in Mongolia, Mongol law required all princes and generals to return to elect a new Khan. Subutai, despite being on the verge of conquering Europe, had no choice but to obey. The Mongol armies withdrew in early 1242 and began a long march east. Europe had been saved not by military victory or divine intervention, but by pure chance. The Mongols never came back. Political struggles consumed their attention. By the time they resolved internal conflicts, their focus had shifted elsewhere. The invasion of Europe became a footnote in Mongol history. For Europe, the relief was overwhelming, but the trauma lingered. Hungarian chronicles estimated that half the kingdom's population died during the invasion. Some regions lost up to 80% of their inhabitants. The damage took generations to repair, and the psychological impact ran deeper. The Battle of Mohi had shattered European military confidence. The idea that Christian knights were divinely protected, that European superiority was inherent, died in the fields along the Sayo River. Despite its massive impact, Mohi faded from memory surprisingly quickly, partly because Europeans wanted to forget this humiliating defeat, partly because it didn't have lasting political consequences. The Mongols left, Hungary recovered, life went on. But the battle deserves to be remembered as a reminder of how contingent history really is. The world we live in exists because a Mongol Khan died at a specific moment. If Gede had lived 2 more years, Europe might have become a collection of tributary states paying homage to Mongol overlords. 40 to 60,000 people died on April 11, 1241, in a battle that should be as famous as Agincourt or Hastings. They died in an invasion that nearly destroyed European civilization. They died in a historical moment that matters precisely because it ultimately didn't matter. And now, almost 800 years later, almost nobody remembers. That's the bloodiest day in medieval history. Nobody remembers. A day when the world nearly changed forever. When tens of thousands died in hours of catastrophic violence. When everything could have been different. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. Not just that it happened, but that we let it disappear.